All right. Yeah. So today we'll just do a few little closing thoughts. I'm guessing, we're not going to go the whole day or anything, the whole session. Obviously, people should feel free jump in, ask questions whenever the moment strikes. Yeah. So I was thinking a good way to just sort of end the semester would be to just talk a little bit, go back to the beginning of the class where I was sort of arguing that the early modern period in philosophy, it sort of like looks like certain philosophical problems that are bothering us more than a lot of the things in 19th century thought. 19th century thought frequently looks really strange, really odd. It's hard to understand. It's hard for us to read, get our mind within. 19th century thought is actually closer to us in a lot of ways, I think, than how the early modern people would have thought of themselves and their relationship to the world. And the big shift that happens, and it happens in a couple different places. It happens in politics, with the distinction between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American Revolution was framed as this sort of like restoration of nature, that the natural rights of the American citizens were being thwarted in some sense by the British monarchy, and so it had to be overthrown to restore the natural balance of things, to restore the world into its appropriate order. The French Revolution, in contrast, 10, 15 years later, is framed as overthrowing one order of the world into a new order of the world where man and reason will be king. So we see it in that political arena, and then the subsequent revolutions that occur throughout the 18th century, 1800s. We also see it in philosophy, starting with Kant and his Copernican revolution, that you could really argue is the most important thing in terms of shaping how modern people see the world, even people who are rigorously anti-Kantians, even people who don't want to do Kant. They're all Copernicans in some sense, and all of us are maybe Copernicans in some sense. To the extent that actually, when we go back and read early modern philosophy, we sort of misread it to sound more like us than it actually does. What is this turn, this Copernican revolution that Kant inaugurates? Well, we're changing the order or the hierarchy of the world. It used to be the case that nature and reality has a structure, and we have to conform ourselves to it in some way. Obviously, this is what's going on in ancient and medieval thought, but even in early modern thought, it's still kind of what's going on. I mean, like, what empiricism is basically the view that as minimally as we interject ourselves as possible, that's how human beings learn about the world. Right? Actually, when we add stuff to what's given to us passively by a kind of perceptive faculty, that's when we screw things up. And so all we need to do, again, you see this a lot in sort of a lot of the political writings as well. All we need to do is sort of like fit ourselves within the sort of pre-established organized hierarchy of the world in the right way. And that will lead to human happiness. It'll lead to virtue. It'll lead to knowledge. It'll lead to whatever. Kant turns all of this on his head, and not just him, everyone after Kant turns this on his head too. The order now has changed. Now, in some fundamental sense, we create nature. We are the authors of the natural world, or at the very least, our understanding of it. But that comes to the same thing as saying the natural world itself, the world we actually engage with. It now speaks of us. It's now oriented around us, organized around us. We are the center here. We are the center of things and the source of the meanings that are found within the world. And so, yeah, we're the ones who now play a key role. This is going to suggest some pretty radical changes to how we conceptualize ourselves on a whole host of different levels. It changes how we see ourselves politically. Now the task has changed. The task used to be to sort of live in accordance with the natural order of things. Now the task is to shape the natural order of things such that it reflects us. Right? And so whether this takes the form of this Kantian infinite project where we're going to make the world better and better and better to sort of make the irrational world better conform to our own rational structure, the Hegelian version of this, which is even more hyper-rationalized, or even the Nietzschean irrationalist version of it, right? Again, there too, the world is shaped by us. Right? The world that we encounter is the world that we project into the world to encounter there. We also see this, though, in kind of a sort of ethical arena. You might weirdly suspect that if human beings are the center of the world, does that mean that all sort of pre-existing ethical standards go away? Well, They might, but it also might be the case that we now have a new ethical project. The project of causing the world to reflect our own rational structures and our own rational moral beliefs. So morality now becomes a project to be realized. And philosophy and politics and everything becomes kind of weirdly utopian in a very strange sort of way, right? We can indeed, there is no natural constraint on our ability to shape humanity, to shape ourselves. Therefore, we can shape ourselves into whatever we want to, and we now have a new norm, a new duty. We have to live up to ourselves as a standard. It's not that we any longer have to live up to human nature or to God. Now we have to live up to ourselves as the standard for the world. We see this also with the transformation of freedom, where freedom suddenly becomes the highest virtue. Freedom becomes the thing that people value above all else. Give me liberty or give me death. Freedom was originally posited as a human faculty to explain a whole bunch of other stuff. It wasn't for its own sake. Duns Scotus, who's probably the biggest figure in philosophy to give us our modern sense of freedom, right? He introduces it in the late medieval period because he thinks he just needs it to make it so that it makes sense for God to punish sinners. That's basically the goal of it. And we have to be free so that God can sensibly punish us, right? It's not for its own sake, it's to account for other things. Or we have to be free so that those who are elected and go to heaven are worthy of the reward. Yeah, either way, it's for the sake of something else. Freedom is just needed to explain certain things. Now in Kant, freedom is like the norm itself. What are we? We are freedom. We are not constrained by any natural necessity. We are this power to shape and restructure the world. That's what we are. That is the new ethic. The ethic is act in such a way that you promote your own freedom. And again, weird to put Nietzsche in those terms. Nietzsche's not going to talk about it morally, but he talks the same kind of way, where like this now he transforms this idea of freedom into will to power. It's a kind of norm governing human behavior. So it tells human beings how we should behave, what matters, what's important in the world. And lastly, we see this in the idea of history. History went from being something that just had its own structure that, again, we just happen to live within. Now, history itself is something that we're going to shape, we're going to change, we're going to make conform to our designs, our wishes. I kind of don't think there are actual conservatives anymore in modern life. There still were in like the early, like maybe up to like World War II, maybe there were still like, if by conservative, we mean basically understanding the world in such a way that human beings just have to fit where they are in the world. There are no conservatives. Modern conservatism is not that. Modern conservatism is just articulating a different vision of the world for us to transform it into, a different understanding of history to make for the future. There is no conforming to anything. And the last thing we see in all of this is art, the role of art. Art goes, there's a line in Heidegger where Heidegger sort of joking about this, where art and creativity goes from being something that really properly only can be said about God in the Middle Ages till all of a sudden it becomes the only thing that matters in human life. Why? Because the artistic activity becomes the central metaphor that you can understand for human creation and all other aspects of life too. The same kind of inspiration, the same kind of creation of something new, that now becomes the dominant metaphor through which human beings express themselves. And so the role of art, the role of freedom in art, all of these things take on new grounds, new bounds, all part of the same movement of making us and our creative activity the center of the world. So let's pause there for a second. Questions, thoughts, comments, anything anyone wants to throw out? It's our last official meeting. So speak now or forever hold your peace, or at least until next time we meet. Anyway, you can hold it. All right. So then if no one's got anything, let's end with a few. What are some interesting implications of this anyway, in terms of our philosophical project?
Sorry, I had a question.
Go ahead, please.
I forgot to unmute my mic, actually.
Oh, that's fine.
So how is this vision transformed going into the 20th century? Like, what's it transformed by? What's it transformed into?
It sort of just becomes an amplification of everything that happened in the 19th century. So things just get more and more amplified. You get some the Marxist side, and then also from the sort of like a quasi-Nietzschean side, you get various forms of sort of like post-truth kinds of government that emerges. with sort of National Socialism and Stalinist communism, where you just sort of like amplify this tendency all the more, where it's all sort of human practical concerns that are at play in things. You get it in the talk of sort of in the 60s and 70s, where a whole bunch of stuff that used to just be elite theory becomes how everyone lives, where we get these commercials telling you to be yourself. Right. And it's super weird, right? I mean, they're not telling you to be yourself in the way Kant would or Nietzsche would tell you to be yourself, but they're still telling you to be yourself. They're still acting as if you're the norm for yourself, as if your creative freedom, as if any kind of restraint put upon you is violence and horrible blasphemy or something, and where just your sheer liberty to make yourself into what you will, that's the highest good. We also see it in the most extreme versions of it in transhumanism, right? That there is no human nature to put any bounds upon us whatsoever. We can just literally shape ourselves by controlling human technologies into whatever we want. And you see this happen in various kinds of arenas. And it starts to occur in respect to things like gender and sexuality, where sort of what were thought of as established sort of natural structures of gender and sex are challenged, where it occurs in political formats, where now sort of radically new kinds of political organizations are thought to be possible. It occurs in philosophy with just the assumption, the sort of obvious assumption that there is no meaning actually anywhere in the world, that all meaning is a feature of human beings, right? That the world itself is just there for us to imprint whatever meaning upon we want, whether or not we do this as scientists, and so we're imprinting rational meaning upon it, whether we're doing this as psychologists and everything, we're just understanding the structures of human cognition, or as linguists, whether we understand this as just language games, that we're just sort of imposing linguistic structures upon a world that doesn't really, that they don't really belong to, or that those language structures don't actually fit the world in anything other than an incidental way. So yeah, I would say the 20th century just amplifies these trends. I mean, existentialism is just Nietzsche and Kierkegaard amplified. Critical theory is Marxism amplified. Analytic philosophy is Frege amplified, or at least some of the philosophy of language stuff that Frege is doing amplified. A lot of, and indeed Kant is still super popular. A lot of natural science stuff will explain itself using kind of a Kantian framework, even though it doesn't go full German idealist on us necessarily. But that kind of framework gets used. I mean, the idea that history is progressing and going somewhere, that's a 19th century idea. That the world is getting better rather than worse. That's a 19th century idea. Yeah, just as sort of we start getting certain technologies that just let us do all of these things more explicitly. Through human productive power, and the actual power to shape the world goes from bombs to atom bombs, and it goes from a windmill to a factory. But that's just an amplification of the trends.
Okay, I guess my follow-up question to that would be, would it be possible to hold any of the same values that we hold today, or even the same structure of society today, without this fundamental background of basically post-medieval modern philosophy? What would our world look like without this background?
So at the very least, we would talk about stuff really differently. Because I don't think actually any new ideas have necessarily been posited. It's how those ideas are justified and grounded that's different. I mean, my thing, so I'm a Plato guy, right? And the way that one of the things I find appealing to me about Plato is what I find is to be sort of really radical ideas about gender and sexuality that I see in Plato, that are sort of suggested by his way of talking about it. But the way that he talks about it sounds really, really weird to all of us. And if you were just to read the passages, you might not see what I'm seeing in it. And maybe I'm wrong to even see it there, right? But regardless, because it's going to sound as if he's talking about there is something that it is to be a human being. There is a human nature, that there is something that it is to have a sex, to have political structures of sexuality and all these things. Right. And so he comes to what I think are pretty profoundly radical conclusions in terms of modern radical gender stuff. But he comes to it in a very different way that sounds super weird to all of us. and it would be challenging to see it in light of that old way of talking. You'd sort of almost have to go back to see what the alternative is to the modern way of talking in the first place, which, yeah, I mean, I think it's actually really hard for us to wrap our heads around how people would have seen themselves even in 1700, let alone in 1500 or, 400 BC. Because it's really a vision of what we are more than anything else that's at the core of all the 19th century. The 19th century stuff like gives a way of seeing ourselves that everything else hinges upon seeing yourself that way. Rowan, I thought I saw you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I know we didn't talk about Freud very much, but do you think he's also part of this like amplification process of
very
philosophy?
much? Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, if we had had more time, the two people we would have read first, we would have read Frederick Douglass. He was the big one I had to cut just because of the online shift and how everything takes longer online. But if we had had an extra week on top of it, we would have read Freud. He's
Okay.
kind of 20th century, but again, he's sort of blurring. It's an artificial date bound. It's an artificial dateline, right? He's similarly doing the same thing, where again, it is like the structure of the human mind that shapes the human world.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a pity we missed out on Freud, but there are other classics for that.
I mean, we're doing about 140 years in the 19th century. we're going from about 1880s, about 1780s to around 1920s of people we've covered, and have to leave some people out, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But Freud's very much part of the same story. The other person is Darwin, actually. Darwin, in a different way, is very much also a part of the same story by giving this kind of naturalized explanation of stuff. It suggests, one, that actually we don't have to see any purpose or telos or anything in nature. At least that's how it gets read anyway. And we human beings discovered that, so therefore, like, we're above nature in a weird sense, right? Like, we have sort of like non-evolutionary standpoint, unless you wanted to say that like recognizing evolution is evolutionarily beneficial. But the fact that we can sort of like see evolution proves that we're above it in some sense, or it means it again creates some new sort of norm for us to instantiate in the world through basically the rise of modern racism. It emerges right along with Darwin as it's this sort of this eugenicist racism, right? That sort of reconceptualizes itself as a sort of genetic project of like purifying the evolution of the human species or something. So grim, it goes in grim directions, right? I mean, the 20th century is a grim century in a lot of ways, but it's the same animus, I think, is driving all of it. I mean, classical racism is just like, we enslaved you, so it would be great if you worked for us, right? And like, it doesn't like, I mean, like, yeah, that's bad too, but like, it's sort of a lot less. It's sort of, in a certain sense, a less violent, at least, philosophy. Right? Like, literally, the Greek justification of slavery is that it's great to have slaves. And like, you lost, so guess what? You get to be the slaves. Sucks to be you, right? I mean, that's, again, it's not that that's not like that's an ethical posture or anything, but it's very much just sort of along the lines of, that's just how the world goes, right? Of course, there are slaves in the world. You happen to draw the short stick. Sucks to be you. And weirdly, ancient slavery is actually a lot, in some respects at least, is a lot less violent than the kind of eugenicist racism that we see today. Slaves could literally buy their own freedom, whereas that's not a sensible category if you're in Nazi Germany, right? Precisely because what we're doing is something different. We're changing the world. I mean, Hitler is in a sense the exemplar of this way of talking in a certain way. I mean, Hitler too makes it very clear that he is trying to make his vision of what humanity is. Again, for better or worse. Any other thoughts? All right, so let's do the last little thing I wanted to do, and then we'll start wrapping it up. Because, like I said, I just wanted to kind of try at least to do a wrap this whole semester into as nice a bow as I could, at least. What are some of the philosophical implications of this stuff in terms of like trends that begin in the 19th century that are going to extend into the 20th century? One huge one is that a battle is going to start to emerge about what reason is and what role it should play in human life. Kant is still basically working from an old understanding of reason. His understanding of reason is still basically medieval. And the same thing for most of the early moderns in a weird way. I mean, you start getting some of them, like Hume especially, is sort of moving in a slightly different direction. But at least a lot of the early moderns, too, are still basically working from a kind of medieval understanding of what rationality is. Reason is this sort of like totalizing faculty that sort of like puts us in contact with reality in some way, in some like fundamental way, right? And so even when Kant talks about there's being a conflict between emotion and reason, the conflict is just that our emotional life hasn't caught up to our rational life yet. And so if you read like the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant basically becomes a virtue ethicist all of a sudden, in terms of like, how do you practically lead a good human life? It's by like making it so that your desires cohere with what it is that your reason is telling you. But there's other ways of articulating reason that are already present in Kant, and he's aware of his sort of dangers, the things I think like it's starting in people like Hume, where reason just becomes this like calculation machine, right? Sort of instrumental rationality is the word Kant gives for this, where all reason does is like calculates how to bring about some result on the basis, some desired result efficiently. Right, so reason sort of just as a handmaid or slave to desire, and then that in turn gives rise to this kind of view of this sort of impartial rationality that's completely divorced from the world, looks out upon it in a disinterested way, and sort of like scorns and despises emotions entirely. And we see this in particularly some of the ways that you start getting some of the stuff that happens post Frege in analytic philosophy. That the analytic philosophers tend to, there's already elements of it in Frege, but they get way more amplified in some parts of analytic philosophy, where it just starts to become like, yeah, like the goal is to purge emotion. Emotion is the enemy of reason. Emotion is the enemy of logic. But that also in turn then, so we have these competing understandings of reason. This is also going to give rise to really different and competing understandings of the role that reason would play in a good and happy human life. And we saw hints of this already, right? We saw Nietzsche be like, yep, reason's stupid. And reason proves that reason's stupid. And so reason doesn't play any role in life at all. It's pure will to power, right? Or maybe in James, where reason plays a role in human life, but that role is at the very least no higher than the role of our desiring or affective parts of life too. And we sort of have to pragmatically navigate the demands of reason and the demands of our emotional states and his will to believe and all of that sort of thing. And Kierkegaard being an even more extreme version of this, who argues, actually, no, there is that sort of disembodied rationality that everyone's talking about. There is no such thing, so it plays no role in human life, and indeed, all that matters is our passionate commitments. And again, that'll be amplified even more in certain versions of existentialism and stuff in the 20th century. So the role and status of reason, that's one of the things that's coming up for grabs, and that the 20th century is going to constantly be sort of grappling with. If you want me to, okay, if you want a proof of this, here's the proof. So have you all heard the Prisoner's Dilemma? Would it be helpful to let me briefly just explain the Prisoner's Dilemma? So the Prisoner's Dilemma is something that emerges in the context of decision theory, or rational decision theory is always what it gets called, where it's basically, so it imagines a scenario where you have two people who are both, they committed a crime, they're partners in crime, and they're both arrested, held in separate rooms, and they're both told that basically there's four options. Either they both lie, at which point they'll get off scot-free. One will rat out the other, at which point the one who does the ratting gets 6 months of jail time. The one who got ratted on gets 10 years. Or they both rat out the other, and then they both get 5 years of jail time. According to rational decision theory, the rational thing to do in that scenario is for you to rat out your friend, because either you're going to get 0 or 5. And if you don't rat out, you're either going to get 0, or 10. So just crunch the numbers. The rational thing to do is to rat out your friend. Okay. So everyone, people more or less familiar with this? Anyone have any questions? That was a very rough explanation. My hope is you're all at least somewhat familiar with the prisoner dilemmas beforehand. Does anyone, any questions about this? All right, so here's my proof that there's a fundamental confusion or debate about what reason itself even means. What would Kant say was the rational thing to do? The rational thing to do would probably be to turn yourself in because you were a criminal and that was bad. And so you need to restore yourself to a kind of moral equilibrium, a moral balance. And suffering the appropriate punishment for your crime will be the beginning of you attaining autonomy for yourself. So you should proudly confess your guilt. Hard to imagine two more different conceptions of rationality at play, right? Because for Kant, rationality has a practical component. It's not just a calculation machine. Reason has a moral, gives us moral demands. Radically different understanding of morality and of reason going on in the prisoner's dilemma. So, yeah. So that's one thing that sort of comes up, is the role and status of reason. That begins to emerge all the more as a more pressing problem. Another thing that starts to emerge is the linguistic turn, especially in analytic philosophy, though it happens in continental philosophy in a different way too. Where since we are now the authors of the world in some sense, we now need to account for the role that our language plays in how we're shaping the world. And again, what we do with this can vary wildly. We can come to the conclusion that we can have no access to the world whatsoever because our language is always going to get in the way. That's more or less at least what early Nietzsche comes to. That's at least the truth and lies in an extra moral sense, Nietzsche at least. That's kind of the conclusion he seems to come to. And a lot of sort of linguistic theorists in the 20th century come to similar kinds of conclusions. We could come to the conclusion, though, that what's in fact really important to do is purify our language of sort of harmful things that are going to get in the way of us properly engaging with the world. And this is what the logical positivists do at the outset of analytic philosophy. They try to revise natural language, get rid of what's misleading in it, so that as the framework for us to engage with the world, now it's a purified framework, the right framework, a rational framework. A framework that we can do science within, a framework that we're not going to run into metaphysical boondoggles like Hegelianism or Heidegger or whatever. Or you can come to the conclusion that we better study natural language as such because natural language is our access point into the world. And that's what the existentialists do. That's what Heidegger's doing, the hermeneutic tradition, Derrida, post-structuralism, where indeed now it's that language becomes our way of access into the world, and the study of language and the study of our linguistic formulations becomes how we learn what it is that we are and what the world is. Right, again, what do we do with language? Right? That's a new development. Another new development, so again, feel free to jump in at any of these. There's almost 6 of us here. You're I'm not too worried about it. Another new development is a sort of crisis point about nihilism and sort of pessimism. If we're the author of the world, that kind of makes the world seem a little bit empty. It seems like the world loses something if it's just a reflection of us. It loses a sort of vibrancy, at least to some people. Some people find this great, but to some people at least, if the world is just a reflection of us, it's lost something. And that loss is usually expressed as a kind of meaninglessness, that the world no longer means anything. I can't get to the thing as it is in itself. I can't get to absolute knowing. I can't get to God. I can't get to anything anymore. The world is just this empty, meaningless place of a whole bunch of humans throwing up a whole bunch of shit on the wall, and none of it really sticks. None of it means anything. And you get reactions against this too, to be clear. But this sort of malaise of a kind of nihilism hangs over both intellectuals in the 19th century and kind of everyone post-World War II, where the Holocaust just sort of becomes the sort of basically World War I in one way and the Holocaust in another way. Both sort of are this like, oh, it's all just empty human pointless activity. There can't be a meaning in a world where World War I happened or where the Holocaust happened. Right? It proves that it's all just senseless human activity. Darwin goes along with this too, right? That it's all just randomness and chance. Yeah, so this becomes in the 20th century, especially, this sort of serious malaise that people confront in various kinds of ways. And indeed, it gives rise to certain conservative reactions against things, like why in the late 80s and 90s does modern conservatism become way more virulent in its sort of like concern. It's because it sees the 60s and 70s as the birth of a kind of nihilism, and it wants to fight back against the nihilism that it sees as built into, you know, so basically the 60s and 70s social reforms. Showing that it's all just social convention and can be changed means that it's all just meaningless. So this fear of nihilism and this nihilism, as Nietzsche predicted, becomes the 20th century in a lot of ways, or at least this sort of like this motivator for thinking in the 20th century. How do we respond to nihilism? To the extent that we have Camus in what might be the most 20th century piece of philosophy ever written, in The Myth of Sisyphus, argue that the only real philosophical question is whether or not you should kill yourself. That's how he begins The Myth of Sisyphus. And ultimately, he concludes no, by the way, in case anyone's curious. He ultimately concludes no, but it's touch and go there for a while. he's really unsure about the matter. All right. And so one last big sort of shift that happens. So it has been the case that science and religion have come into conflict prior to this in history. But they hadn't really come into conflict amongst intellectuals almost, in intellectual life, right? So when the Catholic Church is fighting with Galileo, it's basically like a jurisdictional question. It's not really that no one is like super bothered. No one thinks that anything Galileo is discovering would actually be any sort of real threat to Christianity or anything like that. Starting in the 19th century, the crisis between these two modes of explaining the world become far more pronounced, and it gets tied into a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on within the century. When you get these sort of scientific approaches through German idealism and whatnot, or through Marxism, like you start to get this sense of, hey, reason, we can use reason to do without the irrationality of a certain kind of faith. That, of course, necessarily leads to faith pushing back against a certain kind of rationalism that thinks it can do without it. We already saw this in our readings this semester. We saw James trying to defend a certain kind of faith, and I think in a sort of a weird way, I think he was sort of doing it. But we also see it in Kierkegaard, just being like, yeah, guess what? Reason itself is a kind of faith. Boom. Right? And so it's two visions, but again, now it's two visions of the world to be made. A world to be made as a world of reason and science, a world to be made as a world of reason and faith and passion and desire and art and creativity and all, right? And again, the framework for all of that is sort of emerging now that we have this sort of claim that through kind of German idealistic kinds of stuff, and then through natural science stuff and the analytic tradition in other respects, science, reason can actually get the world perfectly right. The question then becomes, okay, but is that the world we should make? Should we make the science world? Should we make the faith world? Should we make the both world? And what would that even look like? And again, this just becomes a whole host of 20th century movements. All right, and there was a question in the chat, so let me go find that. So someone's asking, what do I think the 21st century of philosophy is going to look like? I have no idea. I have no idea. I guess I'm feeling Hegelian in that sense. I don't feel like I can predict the future. It seems I don't see any reason to think that it won't continue to just be an amplification of a lot of the same things we've been looking at, because the technological tools for realizing some of these ideas are just going to get more and more pronounced. assuming we don't murder ourselves or like make ourselves go extinct through climate change or whatever. I mean, the capacity of human beings to shape themselves possibly into things that are no longer even recognizably human, that's only going to amplify through genetic manipulation, through transhumanist kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, but on the other hand, I've also heard, it seems that like the last 30 years, is not just me, there's a whole bunch of people who seem to be wanting to go back to ancient thought in a lot of ways too, and seeing if maybe there was a missing pathway there that we hadn't taken. So maybe that will continue to be the trajectory. I mean, maybe that'll be the trajectory too. My prophethood has failed. I can't claim to know. Another chat question, someone's asking if they think there could be a resurgence of sort of Marxism. It's possible. It could be the case. I mean, it's certainly the case that the Marxists claim that nature just is the human capacity to manipulate it. That will probably increasingly become how people see nature, see the natural world. If global warming is going to not kill us, it's almost certainly going to be because some sort of mass terraforming activity is going to be carried out by human beings. We're not carbon emissions. That's probably not going to happen. It'll probably be some like crazy, like we're going to terraform the earth, or we're going to just suck carbon out of the atmosphere and make it into something, right? Like where the whole earth, the whole ecological system itself will now be understood as a subject to a kind of human fine tuning, or not just sort of the accidental fine tuning that we've been, or not what's the opposite of fine tuning? Coarse tuning that we've been doing for the past 100 years or whatever. A kind of fine tuning where we're now sort of like actively trying to shape the environment in certain particular ways. And so that at least is a Marxist conception of nature. Whether or not the communist revolution is coming any day now, again, your guess is as good as mine. Doesn't seem like it, but you never know. I mean, capitalism has proven remarkably good at keeping itself alive. We'll see if it continues to do so. And we'll see if even like it becomes relevant. Like it's also possible, go to the Marx and Hegel stuff again, like it's also possible that like 3D printers are basically like replicators from Star Trek. Like if any of you are Star Trek fans, right? Like 3D printers are basically just like slow replicators. They can just like make stuff out of nothing. And again, I know it's not literally nothing, but like it's also entirely possible that material scarcity is no longer going to be a relevant concept in 50 years. And at which point the whole structure of a kind of capitalist economy no longer would even make any sense. So who knows what it'll become? It could become something better, it could become something worse. But I mean, I don't know. There's more than enough food to feed every single person in the world right now. That's never been the case before in human history. It's the question of how is that food organized and distributed, but I could easily see meaningful material scarcity kind of going away as a thing. And then again, would that promote Marxism or be opposed to it? I don't know. Good. Any other thoughts or questions or anything anyone wants to throw out? I mean, this is big picture day, I guess, right? We're not being quite so rigorous and talking in large generalities, but there's definitely a place for that, for contextualizing everything that it is we've talked about.
I actually have a question.
Go
it was
ahead,
kind of
please.
related to the whole Marxism thing.
Mhm.
To what extent do you think that like a given period of time's philosophy is based off of kind of like its material, or like it's material realities, right? So like we have nowadays, and our entire society is based off something like oil production of like cheap, easy to use energy that allows for essentially infinite malleability in nature and like even other people.
Yeah.
Like, do you think that our philosophy is what created, like our philosophy first came up with the idea of like the infinite changeability of the environment, and then we actually put it into practice? Or you think like we discovered our ability to do this as human beings, and then our philosophy kind of arose out of that?
A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, it seems like. So at the very least, so this is leaving the 19th century, but at the very least, Heidegger argues, and it seems compelling to me, that people had to be confident that natural science was going to work before it worked. And that the sort of like technological innovations that sort of like both create but also are created by the scientific revolution, you had to have confidence that those things were going to be made again before they were made. So when Marx is talking in 1848 or whatever, right? Like we still had a pretty limited capacity to shape the natural world to reflect us. I mean, it's better maybe than they did in ancient Greek, but probably not that much better than it was. Maybe you could say he's seeing the productive power of factory capitalist, early capitalist stuff, and seeing where it could go. So that's a kind of materialist condition, but like, it's at least in part the confidence that this was going to work preceded it actually working, and is how it came to work, was that people were seeing themselves in the world in that way. You go back and read Newton and Galileo and stuff. The way that they're justifying what they're doing is super weird and like it's super philosophical actually. Like they feel the need to justify why the way that they're approaching the world makes sense as a way to make the world before they actually like get anything useful out of it, before it produces any useful results. So that's at least a little bit, I think, why for a while everyone was just like, oh yeah, Hegel's silly, material conditions are everything. But it seems like, at least again in the sort of continental circles at least, Hegel sort of comes back because at the very least there seems to be a dialectical relationship between material developments and our sort of like conception of what those developments are or could be. So yeah, that's at least my sense anyway, is that it's more of at the very least a dialectical kind of relationship between those two things, rather than an all or nothing relationship. That it's just one or it's just the other.
Okay, yeah, because like the reason I was asking is that I think that environmental reality is going to be very important to the philosophical field going forward.
Sure.
And if that kind of like access to easy energy goes away, I'd be interested in like kind of like theorizing about what a philosophy in response to that would look like.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great. I don't have an answer to it. I mean, I could see it going in a couple different ways. I mean, if cheap oil goes away or cheap energy goes away, but the conception of what it is that we are doesn't go away, I imagine it will be quite bad, right? Like I imagine it will be a whole bunch of people being like, no, I'm not going to wear the mask because I don't want to wear the mask, right? And I don't care if the material constraints say that I should wear a mask, I'm not going to do it, right? I mean, like that could increasingly be, if a kind of ecological reckoning is coming or something, it's entirely possible if you think the world is just an expression of human will that you could just deny that. I mean, and like, yeah, lots of people will die, but like that we're seeing plenty of evidence that doesn't necessarily stop you. That doesn't necessarily stop anyone. So
yeah, totally. I agree. I don't know. I kind of just, I guess this is me trying to force together two of my favorite topics, which is like energy theory and like also philosophy.
Yeah,
because like,
and it's also another thing that's entirely possible though is that maybe like some new conception of ourselves will emerge, right? One that's more adequate to either to the material conditions or just adequate to the times, or if you're me, more adequate to reality, right? Because like this, I think there actually is a reality that we're sort of subject to, right? And Heidegger actually ends the technology essay that I think at least, yeah, maybe not everyone here, most of you were at least here were in philosophy of science fiction that I had you read the technology essay, right? Heidegger ends that essay by calling for the coming of new gods and new framing, a new way of sort of conceptualizing what it is that humans are. It's happened before, so it could happen again. It's just, again, it's almost like I don't know how we could at least I don't know how I could possibly predict what that would look like.
Yeah, it seems that as products of this kind of society or environment, we're necessarily excluded from the ability to kind of go beyond it almost.
If Hegel's right, at the very least, yeah. Or at least if that reading of Hegel is the right reading of Hegel, and if Hegel is right, then yeah.
Yeah.
we can sort of only know how history has led us to here rather than what's next.
Yeah, no, Spangler too. He talks about that stuff.
Yep. Yeah.
Lots to think about.
Yeah. Good. All right, so that's pretty much all I had for today. So let's start wrapping it up a little bit. So course surveys are coming up. They should be available on Canvas. Really like your feedback. I never taught this course before, so I'd love to know what you all sort of found. Good readings, bad readings. I liked the reader. I'm definitely probably gonna have people use the reader again, but I might change some things. I might supplement it with some more stuff. So maybe places where you wanted to hear a little bit more would also be helpful for me to know going forward. And also, if you have any thoughts about any of just the online transition stuff, because next semester is going to be another weird one, another COVID semester. So if you have anyone has any ideas about how doing this online stuff, how to do it better, what's working, what's not working, let me know about that too. Really value all that feedback. So yeah, if you can, I'll send a couple of reminders about it. Let me know. And other than that, I just want to thank you all for a great semester. This semester was awesome. I really enjoyed it. You all did amazing work. The grades are ridiculous in this class, and because you're all done really good work. You're all putting in good rate. You're asking great questions. The class sessions were great. I at least enjoyed myself anyway. I hope you all enjoyed yourselves too. We learned some good stuff, read some good material. If any of you need anything from me going forward in life, please don't hesitate. Let me know. This class comes with a money back guarantee. Lifetime guarantee. Whatever you need from me, let me know, and I'm happy to provide it. Letters of recommendation. If you want to just talk philosophy, I'm around either like this, or I'll be around in my office when I'm actually in my office again. Happy to, what I like doing is the teaching stuff, the talking to people stuff. That's why I do all the other stuff I have to do. You're never going to be bothering me if you want to come chat about something. Yeah, so don't hesitate to use me as a resource if I can be a helpful resource to any of you going forward. And otherwise, have a great semester, a great rest of your semester. Final papers are due for Thursday. If anyone needs an extension, I can give you till maybe Friday, but they can't give you too much of one just because of when the grading deadline's due. I'm going to have office hours tomorrow. And I can also make appointments next week for anyone if anyone wants to go over any of the material. Yep. Have a great rest of your semester. Have a great break. And for the people who are graduating, congratulations on graduating. And for those who will be back, I hope to see you all in some capacity at least next semester. Anyone wants to take philosophy of religion, let me know. I'll get you in. All right. Have a great one, everyone. And yeah, I will talk to you all later, hopefully.
Thank you very much for a great semester.
Yeah, it's my favorite class.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
hands down.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. And you've all been amazing to working with this semester. I mean, great questions, great work and everything. So.
And you didn't even make us struggle with Frege so hard, which was wonderful.
Frege's one of the best.
Yeah, I think 2 weeks on Frege. You've probably never heard that before.
I have to be honest, I was a little bit surprised too.
I mean, probably one of my favorite readings we did this semester.
Yeah, me too, and I'm a little bit surprised by that. Did not see that coming.
I think the only thing that I was thinking is that wishing we could have spent more time on Hegel or Kant. That would be
yeah.
But figuring out where you'd have to obviously cut somebody, but who that would be and why would it really be worth it to go over something, as opposed to there just being an independent study or a whole separate course focused on pure reason or
we could have easily just done this class as a German idealism class easily. When I was an undergraduate, actually, I had a class that was just on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason.
I'd take that class in an instant.
Yeah. But yeah, as 19th century philosophy, I can't just do the German idealist.
That makes
if anything,
sense.
I might have done too much of the German idealists.
Not enough.
Nah, I don't know if that's possible. Because it's such a critical foundation for everything else.
Yeah, even if it's just reacting against them, you have to know what the logical positivists are reacting against.
Okay, well, I'm going to go get some food for next class.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Thank you very much. I will eventually email you and probably come see you when school's back opened up and COVID's over. So
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm like happy to help with writing samples or anything like that. So just let me know.
yeah, exactly. You know what I'm doing, writing samples.
I at least know a little bit where you're going. So yeah.
I mean, as many perspectives as I can get is gonna be the best. So
Absolutely. That's the right attitude too. Don't take any one person's word for anything, including me. But yeah, get as many get as much advice from as many different people as you can.
oh yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for this
Thank
great
you.
semester.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
You too.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a good one, Rachel.
Thanks, you too.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna pop out too. Thanks
Okay.
for everything again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and enjoy and hopefully our paths will cross in the future.
Of course.
Do some more good fun
Yeah.
philosophy stuff. All right, bye.